Hi, and welcome to the Team Deakins podcast. This podcast is a dialogue between Roger and James Deakins, often joined in the conversation by a guest. It's very informal, and we never know where it will go. We're connecting through Zoom, so bear that in mind when you hear the audio. If you'd like to submit a question or topic, please do so by emailing pod, P-O-D, at rogerdeakins.com. This episode is sponsored by Ingenue. Ingenue has been in the forefront of motion picture lens design and manufacturing since 1935, and their lenses have defined the look of many films through the years. They continue to be at the service of motion pictures and their changing landscape, thanks to innovative solutions for both primes and zooms, inspired by close relationships with cinematographers. This episode is sponsored by Otto Nemetz Camera Rental, newly located in Culver City. Otto Nemetz is known for its premier service and support to productions for 41 years. We've done a previous episode on location scouting, and today we're going to go a bit further into the subject. We'll look at the complex procedure of finding the right locations for a film and the importance of this. To help us with that, we have someone who works as both a location scout and a location manager. We're happy to welcome Dodd Vickers with us today. Thank you, Dodd, for doing this.
Hey, Dodd. Well, I'm honored to be here. Thank you for including me, and I really appreciate the invitation. I'm thoroughly enjoying your podcast and happy to contribute in any way.
Great. Well, our first question always is, how did you get to where you are now? How did you find out about location scouting? Because it's something I didn't know as a child. How did you find it? Did you go down a different path? Did you find it later? Tell us your story.
Well, I did. I found it much later. I grew up, my mother was a veterinarian. My father was a building engineer, and I always thought I wanted to be a cowboy. So I got a little older and realized that wasn't a real career. Well, it was, but it wasn't one I really wanted. And so we grew up showing horses. My dad bought a Super 8 camera at some point, and I loved filming my mom in her practice sessions. We were competing at a national level for different things with our horses, and she always wanted movies to look at before video existed to see how the horse was doing to get ready for horse shows. So I ended up being the cameraman quite a bit. So that was probably my first exposure to that. And my dad was a keen amateur photographer. And I tried to take pictures, but, was very young at that time. My dad was a building engineer. He was one of the people that did all the technical parts of construction and worked for the telephone company. So I always loved following my dad around. And so I learned drafting at a very early age. And I realized much later I wanted to be an architect. So I did go into college to study architecture. And during that time, also took film classes just because I loved film and the history of film and whatnot. And I remember attending a lecture that was on the history of architecture. And then there was a follow-up one that was architecture in film. And really loved it. When I went to Georgia Tech, it was very different than I think it is now. They focused a lot on the more creative side. A lot of what we learned in the first year was space and light and texture and the relationship between space, light, and texture. So we built a lot of organic models. We weren't focused so much on the engineering aspects and the more traditional aspects of what people think architects do. And I loved that. And I think that's what I liked about that lecture with cinema and architecture was it was a lot to do with light. And, they showed us Clockwork Orange and some very early films, the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, where, they created these sets to get this illusion of light with places that didn't really exist. They actually painted the shadows in. And then Clockwork Orange and his use of light. And, of course, all the brutalist architecture in that. And of course, so many of the Frank Lloyd Wright houses that have been used in film were fascinating to me, including, the Ennis House and House on Haunted Hill back in the 50s. there's so many things where architecture played a role in cinema. And so I found that fascinating. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I would end up in the film industry. I ended up leaving school to go fly helicopters. I realized I did not want to be an architect. I was more of an architecture fanboy and still love architecture today. My grandmother knew everybody. She worked at Georgia Tech, where I went to college. And she found out I liked photography and had gotten me a camera. My father's brother was a pilot in the Army, and I decided I wanted to go into the military and fly helicopters. So I did join the military and spent some time in a helicopter unit. But I was the guy with the camera and always was taking pictures, and always mostly black and white. I mentioned my mother was a veterinarian, and we had a dark room in the house. And so I was learning to take pictures and develop my own film and do all that. And my brother actually went to school for photography and was a commercial photographer doing product photography for Coke and other people. And I would kind of follow him around and watch what he was doing and learning how he lit things and whatnot. Got out of the military and went back to college and ended up in the hospitality industry and working for the Ritz-Carlton as a hotel manager, and learned a lot about customer service and people skills and things like that in that time, and continued my love of film, but never again thought that I would ever work in the business. And then one day, whenever my mother was out of town, my brother and I and my wife would be called upon to take care of the horses and the dogs and the cats and the goats and whatever she had at the time. And we were at her farm, and I was leaving after feeding the horses one day, and this giant tour bus pulled up outside her farm and dropped off 1 million people with cameras and notepads and video cameras. And I'm like, okay, these people are totally lost unless they're doing tours of cattle country. So I'm sitting there watching them, and I see this guy get off the bus, and he's looking around, and all these other people are wandering around, and he sees me looking at him, and he walks over and introduces himself. And it was a gentleman that was the key assistant location manager on a movie, and they were going to be filming. Steve Dirks is his name. And he walked over and said, "Is this your property?" And I said, "No, it's my mother's." And, "Well, we're going to be making a movie here, and we'd love to use her property." And I'm like, "Oh, okay, I can help you with that." And so long story short, I spent about a month meeting him and the crew and working with them off and on while they filmed a movie called Wanderlust with Jennifer Aniston. And towards the end of their time at my mom's house, Steve approached me and said, "I don't know if you're interested in a career change or not, but the film industry here in Georgia is about to explode, and we don't have enough people with the basic skills that we need in locations, which is people skills and communications and, attention to detail and logistics. And you seem to have a lot of that going on already. And if you're willing to take a chance, I might be able to find an opportunity for you." And I said, "Well, when you have one, give me a call and we'll talk about it."
Wow.
About a month later, he called and offered me a job on a movie that didn't happen. And I decided I wanted to take a chance. And he said, "Well, let me introduce you to someone else. She's got a movie that's about to go." And he introduced me to Maida Morgan. So, Roger, you probably remember Maida Morgan. She was the location manager on Prisoners. This was far ahead of Prisoners, but he introduced me to her. And she had a movie going, and I interviewed with her, and she offered me the job just as a location assistant, like a PA. And I said, "You know what? I'm going to take a chance." And I did, and was very fortunate to be brought into the world through Maida, who has done such amazing projects over the years, and worked with her as a PA, worked with a few other people. And along the way, I got promoted to the position of an assistant manager. I was working with her when I worked with Roger on Prisoners as an assistant manager, and ended up, here I am in the film industry today.
What is it that interests you about locations?
It has so many facets. I think, the thing that Steve mentioned when he offered me the job at first was the logistics and the people skills and all of that. And I thought that's mainly what it was. And that was a lot of what I was doing in my early days in locations.
The people skills a lot of times are because you're trying to convince someone to let all these dirty people come into their house, right? So you need to be persuasive, right?
Yeah, and I think there's a funny cartoon floating around on the internet that shows the Trojan horse essentially, and it's the
Yes.
location manager walking up to the door of a neighbor and knocking on the door, and we'd like to film in your home, and no, we'll be great. And the Trojan horse shows all the film crew inside of it, and it is kind of that. But it's also trying to, because I have to be the ambassador of the show. Whatever production I'm working for, I'm the face of that production to the people in the town or the neighborhood or the home or the business. So yeah, we have to convince them to allow us to film, show why it's of interest to them and why they should support the film industry. And then it's also the neighbor down the street is not as happy as you would want him to be because maybe he didn't get the notification he should have gotten. So the Ritz-Carlton experience I brought to the table had to do with that. It was the Ritz-Carlton experience is very much about customer service, and we want to be able to go back to any location we film in and be welcomed back. And so I was able to employ some of those skills in what I do. But yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's the ambassadorship, it's the salesmanship, and it's the customer service that are really key pieces of what we do. And then beyond that, I started learning the creative aspect, which is the scouting and whatnot.
And how many people are there normally in the location department on a mid-sized film?
It can vary pretty widely depending on the project you're working on. Typically, there's a manager. If it's a big show, like many of the ones that you've done, there's a supervising location manager. You'll have several location managers working for them in different countries. And then you'll have key assistant location managers, which are like mini location managers handling primary parts of the show. And then you have assistant location managers, which are deployed into the various locations. So a typical show that I work on would have a location manager, a key assistant location manager, at least one or two assistant location managers, and then you've got your location assistants or PAs.
And what are the scouts then? What's a location scout?
Sometimes the scouts are just scouts, and there are many people that do nothing but scout.
And that means going out and finding these places?
Yes.
Is that what that means?
Yeah, and I've been hired just as a scout as well by other location managers. Sometimes I'm one of the first scouts that's hired, and then I'm transitioned into the position as a manager. A lot of times your key or your keys are scouts, but there are times when you just have a show that is so intense, you've just got people out scouting and doing nothing but scouting while you're juggling the scouting, doing your own scouting. And that usually, the early prep of a show is just you and maybe a scout or two. And then you move into the management part. Because once we get in closer to production, my world shrinks quite a bit. I'm dealing with people like the director, the producer, the production designer, the cinematographer, and then transferring that information to my scouts, to my keys, to my assistant managers as far as what we need in order to make the scene work.
Who do you start off working with? When you start on a picture, what do you take with you? I mean, who communicates with you first off?
Well, usually I get called by a producer that has a show. They'll send me the script and I'll review the script, and we'll have a follow-up conversation. I'll have usually done a script breakdown at that point, kind of saying, okay, here are the locations I see in the script. Here are the anchor locations that are the most important. And we'll have a little bit of a chat. They'll say, well, can you go out and do some preliminary scouting? Show us what's available. Here's where we'd like to film. Maybe it's Georgia, maybe it's somewhere else. I've worked other places, but primarily Georgia right now because of the film credits has been incredibly popular. So I'll go out and bring back, they'll give me a certain number of days to give them some samples to show what's available.
And is this during the period where they're still doing the budget?
Yes.
Or
this is early, like they know
really
they want to
early.
make the movie. They're working on a budget. They want to know what the locations look like, what's out there. They don't even get into the numbers until they know they definitely want to come to wherever I am scouting.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So then we'll send them, a week's worth of photos based on what we want to look for. And usually it is focused more on the places we're going to spend the most time. Then they'll have a follow-up chat. And if at that point they say, yeah, we're definitely coming to you, or maybe we're going somewhere else, can you put somebody else out there in another town? Ultimately you get to a point where you've got to sit down and talk to the production designer, who's usually one of the early hires as well, possibly even the director. And they kind of give you a better feeling for, based on your pictures, okay, this house is great, this one is not, and why this one's good, why this one's not. We're looking more for a mid-century modern or something more brutalist, whatever the location is. They'll give you some focus points, like, can we find more of this there? Do you feel this is a good place to find that? And then you go gather more. And at that point, you start putting things more together with budget, costs, size of the crew, and a lot of the things that you learn as a scout. I've been very lucky to work with some incredible production designers and some incredible cinematographers. And I would say that I think I've heard you talk about wishing you were involved earlier on sometimes, because you can give some feedback. And fortunately, I think working with you and working with some of the other people that I've worked with, Dean Simler and Ivan Strasberg and Rachel Morrison, and you get a feel for things that a cinematographer looks for when they're rarely involved in some of those early scouts. So it's an ongoing education for scouts and for location managers as far as what you need to make a movie location work. And we talk about it, in our Location Managers Guild. One of the things that I think is often ignored is there's kind of a casting process for locations as much as there is for the actors. You really need to understand what the director is trying to accomplish, what the production designer sees as the mood of the film or the look of the film, and why this character needs this style of house. And then once you get there, knowing what the cinematographer wants helps you with how long those shots are. What do you need for long lens in this house, or is he going to shoot it up tight? And so it's a really complicated process sometimes to find the perfect location.
In the beginning, you're looking for basically all the locations, because there is a point in prep where we sit down and we go, okay, what's going to be sets? What's going to be locations? So, but you're looking for everything basically in the beginning.
Yeah, our primary focus typically is, where do we spend most of our time? When you do the breakdown on the script, okay, 90% of this movie takes place in this house, then we need to see if we can find the best possible house where we can accomplish the most work, knowing that there's still a possibility we'll build a set. Maybe you've got a bedroom that really you spend a lot of time in, and shooting in a real bedroom doesn't work because you need wild walls, or you need higher ceilings to get the right lighting, or whatever the criteria become. But you've still got to have that anchor location, whether it's a hotel or a field or a barn, or, depending on the story you're telling. Yeah.
So in the beginning, you cast a very wide net and you're looking everywhere. And then eventually it needs to get narrowed down, because the reality of schedules is, if this is your location for this, maybe find locations that are close geographically to the main location.
Absolutely. And that's where it comes down to working with the assistant director and getting a good feel for the schedule and what their hope is. We always joke that the schedule is a dream until it actually starts happening. They've got it laid out. Their first pass at it may be totally unrealistic. You've got this location and then you want to shoot this one the same day. Well, where are we going to find that? And that's where it comes down to when you get a little closer to production, you've got a better understanding of what are the small pieces that you've got to add in to accomplish the filming day. We're going to film at this gas station and there's a big, huge night scene with crash, but we realize it's only going to take 7-8 hours to film that. And we've still got 4 hours to make sure the crew is productive. What else can we add on to that? And so that's where the logistical part of it comes in. And that's where it can get really complicated. We want to avoid moving the crew as much as we can. Is there anything close enough to virtually walk to on the same day? So then it becomes, that's when my world starts shrinking and I start depending more on the team to deliver, because we've got to figure out how we're going to put this jigsaw puzzle together. And I'm dealing with the logistics and the creative while they're out there finding these follow-up sets.
And the other thing that happens too, it seems to me, is that oftentimes in production, an actor's availability changes, so he no longer can be at that part of the schedule. So he moves to another part of the schedule, and it wreaks havoc on locations.
Absolutely. And that is one of the reasons you've got to have a really solid relationship with whoever you've already selected as a location and make sure they understand that. And a good location manager will spend time talking to the homeowner or the business owner, explaining to them, things do change, and here's this part of the contract that says where we can arrange a time to come back. But if it's a location that is so critical, then we try to, I have a friend that works on a show, and he found a school that's critical for their show. So he booked that show for the next 5 years to make sure that, he realized the success of that show was, and that location was going to be so critical. He needed to guarantee access. He needed that complete flexibility. So we don't all have that luxury, but you have to have those same conversations with every location owner or manager or whoever you're dealing with to let you in to film.
And are you negotiating the deal with them?
Yeah, a lot of times I am. Once especially on the big ones, but then you get to a point where the follow-up locations, I have to be able to trust the team that I bring on. My keys and my assistant managers do the same. So you've got to, you're only as good as the team you bring on. And I've been very lucky to work for people that trusted me, like Maida, and then to also bring on incredible people that I trust to go represent me in a good way and represent the production properly and negotiate the deal. And we always joke that we want to be, we have two customers. We have the film and then we have the location. Once the production's gone, we need to be able to make sure that person where we filmed is still happy. So
that's true, because you might want to use them
that's
again.
That's exactly right. Everybody else leaves. I'm still here. And I want them to be happy to see me knocking on their door again, not like going, oh my God, here's Dodd.
I remember on Prisoners, we had a key location, which was the neighborhood where the two families lived.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And it was incredibly complex because we need two very specific houses. And when we found one, we could only use one interior. The second house, we had to have another interior, another house to match. And then we had a lot of night work in the same neighborhood between the two different houses. And there was a whole scene, if you remember, with Jake in the backyards of a whole series of houses going towards a forest. And the whole thing got really kind of complex. And I was counting the other day how many houses we must have got permission with and done deals with that we were either in their backyards or their front yards or putting lights in their windows or changing street lights to outside of their houses. It must have been something like 50 houses, I guess.
Because I think, too, if you do not make sure you've got everybody on board, the production can get there that night and one person won't turn off their lights or whatever, which ruins.
Or you've got one barking dog, in a house, and you're trying to do a dialogue scene next door,
Yeah, no, and I can tell you on that show, Maida, one of the things we were able to accomplish in that neighborhood is we actually found a house that was for sale. We were able to put a contract on the house and use it as our mini locations office. And Mary Louise was one of the people on the show with me. She was kind of embedded in that neighborhood, and that was her sole job. She spent her time constantly talking to those neighbors, to everyone else in there. She knew who had that dog. She had identified all potential problems, and that's the only reason we were able to accomplish that was because of that they knew us that well. I was dealing with similar situations over where we did the liquor store and the apartment building exterior, and that was a really rough neighborhood, as you may recall. And but it was very similar. I needed to know who was the guy that had the business where suddenly we changed our mind and we wanted to put the car in a different position to get the shot through the window or whatever. And that's where it's so important to have those relationships with the people in the area where you're going to film.
Yeah. Have you been back to either of those places? Are they still talking to you?
Oh yeah, no, I absolutely. I mean, I haven't. I've been near the neighborhood. And I've been, that one where the liquor store has been filmed for other things for sure.
Yeah, I bet.
But
yeah.
not the exterior. That is an area called the Bluffs. I don't know if you've ever, there's it's turned into a pretty bad drug neighborhood. And it's one of those crime-ridden areas in downtown. And one of my cousin's husbands is a APD officer. And whenever he sees me down in that area scouting, he's like, Dodd, what are you doing? Get out of here. But it's beautiful, and there are parts of it. And it is filmable. We had the buy-in of the neighbors, I will say. There was a neighbor there that knows everybody in that area, and he was incredibly helpful. And you have to find those ambassadors in those kinds of places that know who to talk to. And no matter what's going on in the neighborhood, show them the benefit of having a film there and the economic benefit and, how it can help the area and leave a good mark on the community.
Yeah. So, I mean, we had night work there as well. I just remember all the people in the neighborhoods, both those locations were really great. And when you think you're there at kind of 1 or 2 in the morning and you've got to make noise moving cranes or just trucks coming in and out and light shining in windows, it's so much down to the location department to smooth that kind of passage, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
And so you have basically a file of locations because as you go out, you just keep them in your back pocket. So you've got them. It seems to me sometimes on shows that people are only going to their files and not going out and finding the new stuff that we need because we don't want what was on that other show. It's just not what we want. So I think that could be a failing if you were starting out and thinking, oh, well, I'll just get this database and just use the database.
Right. No, and I use the, I'll use the files that I have as like, if they say do a file pull, like show us what's there. Yeah, I can do that. But, my scouts, when I sit down with them and I've been given a directive, I'll say, we need, this. And they'll say, oh, well, that's this place. And I'll say, yeah, that's a good example of it. But what else is there? So that is the challenge, is always finding something new. And we always want to find something new because we don't always want to go back to the same place. But at the same time, there are certain looks that are incredibly hard to find. And there are certain places that have been filmed a ton because those looks are so good. But then we have to say, okay, well, let's look at the scene. What's the storyboard look like? What has the director told us? What has the production designer told us? So even though this neighborhood has been filmed and we know that look will work, how can we photograph it to see if it can work again and not look like the same place? And I think that's where the creative aspect of what location managers and location scouts comes in, is thinking a little outside the box and trying to find a new location. But also, if you've got to go back to one that has been filmed a ton, how can you present it in a way that shows it as if it's something brand new?
Yeah. And when you're looking at a location, considering a location, do you think about the logistics of the actual shoot, the fact that you've got to get equipment in, a lot of night shooting, so a lot of lights are going to be on the outside, is the ground level, all of that kind of thing. Do you know enough at that point when you're looking for it to be thinking about?
Yes, absolutely. You should. And those are things like I've had people bring me pictures and I will look at the location and go, well, this is a problem. But then also it's so good. Is there a way to overcome that problem? So you definitely have to look at the logistics, and that's where the management side of it comes in. Where are we going to park the crew? Yeah. Is the location so remote where we can house the crew? Is there a hotel nearby? Where are people going to stay? Those are things that have to be considered. And the production manager a lot of times is involved in those early conversations, but then the creative gets involved and says, this is the perfect location. How can we solve this problem? And so we definitely want to figure that out if we've got the perfect location. And there are ways to slice and dice it. It just depends on what they're willing to invest, because obviously we are a slave to the budget.
Yes. And if you find a location that's absolutely perfect, but there's no way to get equipment in, so you have to build a road, which happens a lot, does that come out of your budget? The expense of building a road?
The road building, yeah.
It comes out of the budget. A lot of times money gets moved around. Sometimes it's like, okay, well, construction doesn't need this much money for this now because we're filming this here. So we do shift money around, and we work with the UPM or the line producers to figure that out. When we start off, we are given a basic budget, but then things do change, and you have to figure out, okay, we've committed to this. Where can we find the money for it without going back and asking for more? So yeah, typically you're working to balance, okay, this is now not a set when it was going to be a set, and here's what they had budgeted to build that set. Can we make that work and move that money from construction to locations, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's definitely a juggling act on an ongoing basis. And that's why it's got to be a conversation with everybody involved as far as what is the value of this set? Is it that important? Or can we accomplish it in a cheaper way?
Yeah. And which ones are we going to compromise on? Which ones are we going to really push for the best possible?
Yeah, well, it's such a balance, isn't it, between the look of the location and the scene that you're shooting, because sometimes, I mean, it's interesting. I think what you're looking for can be different. It could be, two directors or three directors could look at the same script, but demand something different of a location to do the same scene, because, somebody might play a scene in a single shot. You might only want 3 walls. Whereas another director might do it much more fluid way and would need the whole set. So I know, working with Joel and Ethan for so many years, they would often say, well, we only need a wall. So there's no point finding a location. There's no point taking the crew to a location, because we can just put a flat up in a warehouse and shoot it with a picture on the wall and one shot.
Right.
So it's understanding that, isn't it, makes a big difference. I feel I need to understand that, or get a handle on how it's going to work visually before I can put my input into whether it's a location or a set, how much to dwell on the look of a location. I remember on Prisoners, for instance, we really wanted the opening scene to be in a forest with snow on the ground and this deer. Well, there was no way we could find that location, and it was only like 1 or 2 shots. And to put that with any other scene in the schedule was impossible. So suddenly that became a pre-shoot. So it's all these, and you only had to look really one way. So we didn't have to go deep into a forest. We could be right next to a road. There's all those sort of things you trade off tricks, eventually, isn't there?
Yeah, and it's also balancing, that particular shot. I think because we chose that location inside of Stone Mountain, you go and find a forest to shoot in. It's not as groomed as that one was. When you get right in that area, they're so active in cleaning out and doing underbrush and whatnot. You could get a little longer shot versus going into a lot of just like, here's a forest, go walk out in there, and then you've got all this underbrush to deal with and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so, that's exactly true. It's finding out like, oh, well, we can park the trucks right here on the road, walk 10 feet, and we're in the forest as far as anybody else knows for sure.
Yeah.
Are you sometimes disappointed when they say, you know what, we'll do this as a set, we'll build it? Are you disappointed because you think, oh, I would have loved to have found that?
Sometimes, and then sometimes you totally understand. You get it, that it doesn't make sense, that as beautiful as the location you brought to them for it, maybe it doesn't make sense to move the company to it. It's when you look at the scene, you realize that as pretty as it was, there are limitations that couldn't be overcome to accomplish and make the shot look the way the director, the production designer, the cinematographer really wanted it to look. So yeah, you are disappointed that, it's kind of a competition. I will say that when you've got location people out scouting, we always kind of go, up, ding for Dodd or ding for whoever, you always want to go up, I found it, so you kind of play each other against it in a good way.
Yeah.
Because it's not hard. It's not easy. And when you find a great location that suddenly the director or Roger's in love with, you want to be the one that found it, of course. But it is disappointing for sure.
Yeah. And I imagine also knowing how long or how flexible they are. If they say it's got to be this week and it's only this week, being the location people
right.
that own the location, that's a downside compared to another location that you can have for 2 months without having to pay for 2 months.
Right.
Only pay for when you're using it.
Yeah, on that note,
Yes.
again, on Prisoners in particular, we needed weather cover because both Denny and I wanted to shoot in overcast light, which didn't seem, like we were going to be so lucky with in Atlanta at that time of the year. In fact, we were quite lucky, so I don't think we went to weather cover more than once. But how does that affect you as well, weather cover? And
Yeah, that is something. It depends on the time of year. We're definitely looking at weather daily. And as you know, Georgia weather is so incredibly unpredictable. I mean, typically at that time of year, it is blue skies a lot. But that particular year, we got the help of the weather. It was one of those that we got more rain and things than we had gotten in a long time.
yeah.
So that helped us.
I remember that even the last day of the shoot, and we had to shoot that day, and it was out on the freeway.
Yep.
It was like the opening sequence with the man and the kid, and we had a light drizzle all day and a perfect grey sky,
Yeah.
and it was the last day of shooting, and we couldn't have shot anything else, and we couldn't have delayed it because all the crew that were from out of town had their flights booked, and Denny was going back to Montreal and all this, and we had the perfect day. I couldn't believe it. And it's, as you say, usually in Atlanta it's bright blue sky at that time of the year. Does that restrict you though? I mean, that if you're looking for weather cover, that means a certain location you have to have on hold for a longer period, right? And that has a knock-on effect on how you work.
Oh, absolutely. And that's, whenever somebody comes to me and say, this is a 100% location show, that's when I get nervous. When I don't have a stage, when I don't have something in my hip pocket to fall back on, that's when I get nervous.
In England, they call it the phone box. It's a proverbial phone box that you carry with you for the whole shoot because it's something you could do any day.
Right.
Yeah. But so really you want something that is on stage or a very cheap location that you can hold, right?
Yeah, we do try to find something where we've got enough time in it and it's kind of this floating thing that we can move to any day because of the actor availability. That's where it really does come down to communication with everyone involved as far as what are our limitations. Like if we had to go to this place, what are we missing? Is that actor there? I think when people that aren't in the business listen to these things, they're surprised to hear that some of these actors are not there just once we begin filming, sitting around waiting on their next scene.
Right.
And that's just not the case.
Yeah. I was surprised after the first film I did, because the first feature film I shot was in Scotland. We had all the actors for like 8 or 9 weeks, and we could do anything we wanted. Mike and I, the director, Mike Radford, and I would get up in the morning and say, we'll shoot this scene because it's going to be cloudy today or whatever. And we always had the actors with us. So I was surprised later on that all films are not like that.
It must have been a terrible shock.
It was.
You're still
It's
getting
a
over
great disappointment. I haven't got over it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking about it so passionately. Yeah.
But especially when you're doing like television, it becomes even more difficult because a lot of those actors that are involved sometimes have 2 or 3 different projects going on, especially if they're not a featured performer. Maybe they're a guest star in a couple of episodes. So if you ever do episodic, then it becomes even more complicated working with the AD, and this person has to go home for this, or they're filming on that day, or they have a private event that they've committed to, and so you definitely have to have a clear understanding. If we have bad weather that day, what are our options? So whenever we see something happening, like the hurricane that's going on as we talk about this, if I were filming right now, that still impacts Georgia weather. We were getting more unexpected pop-up showers than normal right now. So we'd be talking about where are we going to go? What's going to happen? If we're outside, what are we going to do? So we're looking a week in advance and then daily looking at those weather reports to see what we think it's going to look like on Friday so we know what we're doing.
Yeah.
And what's the difference between TV and film? Because if you're doing a series, aren't you using a lot of the same sets throughout? Not sets, locations. Like if they live in a house, you might use that house for the whole season.
Well, you would think so.
Yeah, you would, but I don't know.
No, what happens a lot is you'll start out and you'll go, okay, we need this house. It's going to appear and this is a key location. So yeah, then all of a sudden a certain character or the studio will look at the dailies or start realizing this character is going to become more interesting to people than they anticipated. And suddenly they're saying, hey, we're probably going to go back to that location. And unfortunately with TV, you don't have the scripts in advance like you do in features. I have done episodic where you've got everything ahead of time, but it is subject to change. But a lot of times when you're doing episodic work, you might get a new script every 2 weeks. And suddenly you've got 10 days to scout and clear it and have the buy-in of whoever the director, in an episodic, you're alternating directors a lot. Maybe this episode is directed by one person and the next one's directed by somebody else. So you've got to figure out the time to go scout it. So you're moving at I always joke that when I get to feature, it's like a vacation almost in a way compared to doing episodic. It's like a marathon when you're doing episodic sometimes because of the changes and the dynamic nature of it.
Do you get circumstances then when you have a house in the first episode and the producers want to go back to it in the 6th episode or something, and the people that own the house don't want to cooperate?
Or they know what a film crew is.
No, it's happened. And it's also happened that people get involve you and you're good to go and you film, and then suddenly neighbors become problems because they didn't expect the crew to be there. And a lot of times it's that, more as much as it is the people that own the house, is making sure you can keep the neighbors happy, especially if you're filming something in a higher end neighborhood. But it doesn't really matter where you are, because part of it is we're paying everyone inconvenience fees. And all they hear is there's a movie in town. And the next thing you know, everybody thinks you have much deeper pockets than you may have. And you're trying to help them understand that most of that money's gone before they ever give me any money to come do this. But I want to be fair with you. We talk about we do good business and we want to be fair to everybody we deal with, but we don't have unlimited funds. I've had neighbors that they just said, I don't want anybody parked in front of my house. Well, technically our permit allows it, but we want to be able to come back to the neighborhood. So we do everything we can to make sure nobody parks in front of their house and make sure they realize we're trying to do that, so that when I have to come back and ask for them for something later, they realize I've followed through and I've told them I'm going to do what your word has to be good to these people or they don't trust you. And that is a key part of it, is trust when you move into somebody's neighborhood.
Yeah, I can understand why they don't. I remember when I was doing a film early in my career in London, things were a little bit more anarchic back then. We were doing this scene in an apartment on the 3rd floor in Marylebone, London, and none of the neighbours had been told that we were shooting there. And it was a one-day shoot. We did a couple of shots, but nobody, the authorities and nobody had been told that we were going to blow the window out at the end of the day, because the idea was that there was a bomb put in this apartment. So we were shooting 3 cameras outside. The window gets blown, goes into the street. Suddenly all these police cars are coming and we realized they're real because nobody had been told that we were going to do it. But we got away with it. It was a good shot, actually. But those were the days.
I have a friend that's a production designer that was doing a crack lab in a mobile home park. And they went in and did the design and set it all up and got it approved, tech scouted it, and then they weren't going to film it for 2 or 3 weeks. And so they just kind of locked it up and walked away and then came back. And as they walked in to double check it like 2 days before filming, they got raided. It's
functioning.
Oh, wow. Somebody had been looking through the window and saw this, paraphernalia and realized it looked like a crack lab and called the police. Nobody bothered to inform. I don't know who the location manager was, and I never asked. But they should have done a better job of communicating with the local authorities to make sure they understood.
But it's quite flattering, really, because it's very realistic, obviously.
I mean, you will look through the window, you would think they're making crack in there. And sure enough, here comes the art department, and boom, the police are arresting them and locking them up. And then it took about a day to convince them, no, this is a movie set, and a mobile home park
Yeah.
being as transient it is, getting hold of whoever the manager was and that kind of thing to make sure they understood this is true. They're telling you the truth,
Yeah.
I know I've been on shoots too where supposedly we had a hard out at 10 because we told the neighborhood we would wrap then, and then there'd be another hour for the wrap up. And the director won't stop. And I remember always looking at the location people and feeling so sorry for them because they've given their word. They know these people. The director doesn't know anybody.
Yep.
And he's just going, no, let's go another 4
shot.
hours.
Yeah.
No, that happens. And,
It's really
that's
not
where
fair.
I talk about the trust relationship you have to build. And you have to have the right person, like we did on Prisoners, embedded into that neighborhood so that if something changes, that they Mary Louise can go knock on that door and say, hey, I know we told you this, but here's what's going to happen and here's why it's going to happen. And that they believe her and trust her and will work with you. There's some things you can't overcome.
Yeah.
I mean, some people are just never going to be happy no matter how hard you try. But you can just walk away
that's
knowing
true.
you've done your best, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And do you sometimes say to the neighbors, well, as a special perk, you can come have catering or something?
Yeah, I mean, we try to do that where it feels appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
We've had people. I did an Adam Sandler movie, and some of the folks that were involved in the properties we were using started to abuse it a little bit because they realized they could sit on set every day and talk to Adam and his family. And, Adam is so accessible compared to some people. But you just have to be careful with that and know where you feel it's appropriate. But yeah, you definitely do that. I had a property owner where we were going to be filming in their house for a month. We found out they were theater people and did acting in their local theater. So we made sure they were featured extras in a scene.
Oh.
Yeah. I mean, I will
That's
tell you a
great.
quick story. When we were doing Prisoners, the house next to the house where the pit is, we needed, you asked for some additional lights and some bushes and things next door.
Yeah.
And I went over and I fortunately had a really good relationship with them, and I'd never met their son. And I mentioned to you earlier, my son has autism, and I met their son and I felt like he was on the spectrum, and he was asking all these questions about the shoot and whatnot. And he didn't know any of the actors' names. And I mentioned Wolverine, and he's like, oh, Wolverine is next door. And I said, yeah. And he's like, oh, that's so cool. So we made the arrangement to put the lights in their bushes and whatnot. And then I'm back at Crafty and I see Mr. Jackman and I tell him the story. And he's like, oh, mate, that's so cool. Which house is it? And I point to the house and he's like, oh, that's really great. I see him leave the set and his driver pull in the driveway. And I see Hugh get out of the car and go knock on the door.
Oh.
And I see him dip in the house and he's gone for 15 or 20 minutes. And I see them the next day and they went, oh my God, he came back. And he so apparently he went back and I didn't even know it, and had brought him all sorts of signed memorabilia from Wolverine and took pictures with them. And, those things go a long way.
Yeah. It makes such a difference, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. It's just sometimes hard to convince the actor of that because they're tired and cranky.
Yeah.
I can do it if I can get a picture with the actor.
bet.
And I never guarantee that. I say, usually if you just are relaxed, it might happen because, as you know, the actors are human beings. And if they see somebody and they know it's a homeowner, a lot of times people will just walk them and say, beautiful house. Thank you for letting us use it. But I can't guarantee them that's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you watch a movie, do you think
all
about
the time.
locations? Do you think, oh, really?
To the point it's distracting to my wife. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
She already has enough trouble when we're out driving around and going to a family event, and suddenly I'll just turn down a road that she knows is not going to take us anywhere close to where we want to go. And she's, what are you doing? Are we scouting?
Just want to have a look.
Scouting. I've always wanted to know what's down this road. But
So you're always scouting is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. It must bug you when in a scene you'll be in one location, in a film, you watch a film and in a scene, you're in one location and then it cuts and you're sort of like 50 miles away or 20 miles away for the next shot. It's meant to be continuity.
Yeah, it bugs me, but it's brilliant at the same time that it's convincing. I think when you pull it off, it's amazing. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of like
Yeah,
Prisoners.
yeah.
You talk about the apartment building next door. Well, we only filmed the exterior of it. When we went to the inside where he's holding Paul Dano's character, that's all on stage. But you wouldn't know it.
Yeah.
You felt like you were in that building. So as long as you're successful in the convincers you need, well, I mean, I would say same thing with 1917. The way you hid the cuts to make it feel like one continuous thing that's an art form, just like convincing people you're inside a place you just walked out, saw the outside of.
Yeah. It's all an illusion in the end, isn't it?
Yeah. I can imagine that it takes a little bit of time to get into a director's head, especially if they're not as communicative maybe as another one, and if you've just come off of a completely different film. I would imagine that it's hard to start thinking like that director, and yet you have to as soon as
Absolutely.
you can.
Yeah, and that's where the relationship you have, especially early on with the production designer, you have to trust that the director and the production designer have a good relationship at that early stage, because that production designer is going to be driving, what you're looking for. When I did Sharp Objects for HBO, Jean-Marc is a different type of filmmaker. He likes using natural light, and I'm working with Jean Pano, who's the production designer that's worked with him so many times. And he's telling me, don't worry about lighting. Don't worry about lighting. And I'm like, I don't know how not to worry about lighting. But he's like, well, that's just, I'm kind of your lighting designer. I was like, how is this possible? And he's like, it's just how he shoots. Don't worry about it. If I tell you need a light bulb on this porch, that's all they're going to want. And so you definitely have to adapt to every project based on who you're working with, and trust that the people you're talking to early on know what they're doing. But then it is incredibly valuable when you can have that time, even pre-tech scout, to get a cinematographer and director and production designer to go do those early scouts with the last.
That's what Roger always does now.
Yeah,
he's always on the early
it's
scouts.
Important as much as you can.
Insist. I mean, it's like you can so easily come unstuck without having not been on early scouts, especially when there's like key locations involved that are going to set the whole scene of how the other locations are going to be found around that one key location. And if there's things about it that you can see as a cinematographer that don't make sense, it's important to be there as early as possible. I mean, certainly that happened a number of times on when I did Skyfall with Sam. There were certain things that didn't make sense to be on location, for instance, especially as they were abroad. So, you want to be there and give your input. And then, okay, if the final decision is still to go with a location you think is going to be difficult to
but at least you can also
then you do it,
warn the departments.
Yes,
you can say, there's got to be a road. There's got to be a this. And so everybody knows. Yeah. Have you ever been in a situation where you were communicating with the production designer because the director was very busy in the beginning, casting or whatever, and you got the distinct impression that he was going down one path and the director might be going down another path?
Yeah.
And what would you do? And what do you do?
Because you're trying, you're kind of trying to serve everybody. We've got to make all sides of production. I've got to keep the UPM and the budget happy. I've got to make sure the director accomplishes what he wants, the cinematographer, the production designer, and then the people that own the locations where we're going to film. And I've had situations where cinematographers and directors thought they were going to get along, but it was their first time working, and suddenly they're not working together anymore. Same thing with a production designer, thought they were going to be great with this particular director, and nope, turns out they weren't. And suddenly you're finding a whole new direction. I've spent months pre-scouting for things, and then suddenly find out, no, they decided a different production designer will work, and they want a completely different look. And you're out looking for something totally opposite of what you started looking for.
Wow.
But that's unusual, I would say. I wouldn't say that's common. But it does happen, for sure. But everybody that you are working with has a different idea of what they want. And, we are kind of the master. I mean, we're the servant to so many masters as the locations department when it comes down to it.
Yeah, I can imagine. With the production always telling you, well, let's not spend too much money.
Well, that is it. And then that's where you say, okay, but how critical is this location? Is it worth the extra money? Does it give us the production value? I've had locations that we found that weren't exactly what we were asked for, but gave us so much more that we made it work, because we realized, like you were talking about, suddenly you realize you just need a wall for a scene. Well, maybe we can find a place inside this location to shoot that scene with the wall, and then help justify the added expense of that location, because it gives us so much more in the other areas. So that's where you have to kind of look at, and that's where I think it really helps to have really detailed conversations, especially if you can have storyboards. So I have a feel for how they're thinking the shot might be photographed. I have Artemis and a lot of apps that a lot of people would think would not be necessary for a location manager to have, because I've been asked, what is this going to look like on this millimeter lens, or where's the sun going to be at this time of day? So I carry a lot of the apps that the cinematographers carry, just so that I can answer those questions for them and try and be as productive as I can when I'm in the field.
Right. Well, it is kind of crucial, isn't it, to know where the sun's going to be? I mean, that is the first thing. I mean, if there's an extended scene on an exterior location, then that's one of the first things I'll look at when I'm on a scout. And then the other thing is, I'm very aware that you're often looking at location photographs early on before you go on a scout. And you might look, I mean, I've learned this very early on. You look at a photograph and think, that's fantastic. Okay, we'll definitely go there. And you drive 40 miles or 50 miles and you look at that photograph and it's not what you expected, because it may be wonderful in one direction, but you turn around and there's a schoolyard, or there's one place there was an airport with jets taking off.
Great.
I mean, it's that famous scene in the documentary of Terry Gilliam's film,
Man of La Mancha,
Man of La Mancha in Spain, where they were starting to shoot and there was an airport, Air Force base right next door. So every time they started to roll the cameras, a jet took off.
Great for period films.
There's all these sort of, but there's unexpected things, isn't it? You really have to stand there. That's why I find the idea of location scouting now in COVID times remotely, I don't see how that makes sense, because it's great looking at images as references for locations, but without actually standing there and feeling it and getting a sense of, what lens is this going to be on,
We're trying to figure out what are the next steps. I'm about to start production on a sports film, and it's 90% outdoor locations. That's why I was thinking of the sun angles and whatnot. I take Sun Scout out with me. I've got Artemis with me when I'm shooting these soccer fields and whatnot. And we're also figuring out, in general, as a group, what is the value of 3D scouting? Is it helpful? We obviously want to think about, until we have a better solution long term, how do we minimize trips to the location? But there are certain trips that I see are going to be difficult to overcome. I think somebody like yourself and the grip, the key, the best boy, are going to have to go to those locations, but we're going to have to be very conscious of how we do it, unless we own the location and just can shut it down. It's difficult. There's a lot of conversation about the 3D scouting, like you said, so that people can virtually look at things. But you're right. When you're doing 3D scouting, though, you're looking at an extremely wide angle, and you might not be shooting it that way. And it's probably hard for you to visualize from a 3D photo what that location is going to look like. So let me ask you a question, right, if you don't mind. So if I'm out scouting for you, obviously reverses are critical, and it's one of the things I learned the hard way, and I teach my scouts very early on. Make sure we know what the reverse is, even if only you think we need that hallway. I need to know what's behind you, just in case we turn the camera around and we don't expect to. What angle, like if I'm putting a lens on a camera to go shoot something for scouting purposes, I do shoot wide a lot when I'm in a house, but then I'll always go down from there to make sure I have more traditional eyesight, like what it looks like with my eye, like a 35 millimeter. What do you, if you're teaching a scout what to go shoot, what would you tell them to shoot? What angle, what aperture, what lens would you tell them is most useful to you when they're shooting an interior or an exterior for that matter?
Yeah, I would tend to ask the shots to be done on something, not an 18, something more of a 27 or a 32. And, I like a panorama done on a 32 as opposed to one shot done on an 18. Yeah. You know what I mean? So I can feel the space a bit better like that. I relate to that a bit more easily. But it's very hard to do it without standing there, even if you've got a video of a location, a scout walking through a location. I mean, yeah, it's informative, but I would be very nervous of signing off on somewhere without actually standing there and being able to sort of take it in myself.
Yeah, I always try to look for something in at least a couple of the shots, whether it's a person walking through or a car driving by, to help give perspective as well. Because I do realize that that helps you understand the space a little bit better. Even if it's not a great shot of that person, at least you see a person in the space and you know what it is.
Yeah. But you see, like I said about, maybe you could do a scene against the flat with a picture on a wall, I mean, it's sometimes you see a location and you think, yeah, all that is rubbish. 270 degrees is rubbish. But that house and that driveway or that little piece there is perfect for the shot we need, So, and it's very hard to get that sense out of a photograph, I think, because it's, obviously, I hope I'm photographing something in a personal way so I can look at an overall feel of a location. But till I'm standing there, I don't understand what the shot will be.
Yeah, and it's funny, you were talking about problems with the direction you were given earlier, and I tell you the worst experience I had, and I won't tell you who it was, but we scouted the location 3 or 4 times with the director and the cinematographer, and they said, no, this is it. This is perfect. I want this angle. Here's the look we need. This is going to be great. We went there at day. We went there at night. On the day of filming, we get there and it's 10 o'clock at night. We were already running late. And suddenly the director turns around and he goes, no, I want this. And it's 180 degrees from what you were asked to get. And suddenly you're at 10 o'clock at night, knocking on people's doors, trying to convince them to let you put a light in a window or something. And that's where the challenge comes in. And that's where you're frustrated because you think you've done everything you can to prepare for the day of shooting to deliver what the production needs. And then you're suddenly asked for something completely different.
Yeah. Yeah, I've definitely been there as well. And then if not only you have to get permissions, but then I have to light it. A night shoot at like 2 a.m, and you think, we've got the scene, and then director suggests something, and it's his prerogative, and that's fine. But suddenly there's a whole mass of things that need to be done to make that shot work.
And everybody wants to go ahead and do it before those permissions are gotten.
Yeah.
Just wait for a moment. Let me get the permissions.
Yeah, and I think the people...
I mean, part of it's the fun of it in a way. I mean, if it was all too easy, it wouldn't be... So interesting.
So it's very interesting.
Absolutely. It is the fun of it. I mean, because we do, I never want to be the person saying no. I always want to be the person saying yes.
Right.
But you have to also be realistic about it. And you don't want to build false expectations with the production that you can deliver something you can't. So I always want to find a way to say yes, but sometimes the answer is no. And if I say no, I want people to trust me and know that I'm saying no for a reason. I'm not saying it because it's easy for me, because that isn't the fun part. The fun part is overcoming the challenges. The fun part is, how can we do this?
Yeah. Dealing with the challenges. But in the end, it's such, shooting is a compromise, and especially here, we're talking about locations, but you're also talking about shoot time. I'm talking about the cost of a location and how you service it. So, I mean, you might have a location, for instance, that is absolutely wonderful, but there's nowhere to park the trucks. Or it's far enough away from the next day's work that you need somewhere to park the trucks that is halfway between the two different locations. So all those logistics actually have an impact on your shoot time because they have an impact on your call time, which has an impact on the amount of hours of daylight you have if you're shooting at day exterior, doesn't it? So it's quite a sort of jigsaw that I don't think people really realize
Yeah.
how complex it can become, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Very
no,
true.
it's much more than people think, and I think that's one of the reasons the
Yeah.
LMGI came together, is to try to help people understand. You know, we've got the LMGI awards coming up. 1917 is one of the ones nominated for outstanding locations in a period film.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, how cool is that?
And we're going to have to do it virtually, like everybody is doing with these award things right now.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
you know, I think a lot of people don't realize what, you know, when I tell people what I do, it's one of the questions I ask in the podcast a lot when I'm talking to location managers. You know, my family here's the stories. But extended family, you say you're a location manager, they don't know what that is. They assume it's a scout because somewhere they've heard of a location scout. But when you really get into permitting, logistics, insurance, you know, budgeting, and then there's also a creative side. That's where it's, you know, we're hoping to raise the profile a little bit of what we do, because I don't think a lot of people understand. I don't think half the crew understands what the location manager really does.
No.
I think they think we tell them where to park and where the bathroom's going to be and where we're going to eat lunch. I don't think they understand the role we play far beyond the time they show up to make the movie.
Yeah. I think maybe your training as an architect was very good. You know, Luchino Visconti was an architect.
Oh, you know, that's true. Now that you say that, I wouldn't have thought of that, but I do remember reading that somewhere.
Yeah, there's a number of very well-respected directors.
Yeah, I love architecture. I love architectural photography, and you know, I do a lot of black and white. Yeah. And it's funny because I've had directors and people say, if you get a good black and white shot, throw it in your scout photos, because sometimes that helps me get a feel for what it looks like, and I can colorize it. You know, I can figure out what the production designer does. Take a pretty black and white picture. That's fine. You know? Yeah,
that's really interesting, because I've found that sometimes I've looked at a location manager or scout's photographs and think, well, the location's not right, but that's a really interesting image. You know, because you're always looking at images, and any image can suddenly inspire something. And the best location scout story we ever had was on Skyfall, when we had a location scout photograph this island off Japan, which was an abandoned coal mine. You know, it's like an island that was built up as a coal mine. And we were going to shoot there, a sort of a reduced unit shoot. And yet the location scouts' photographs were so good that we could use those photographs, shoot our actors against a small set piece, and then paste them into the location photographs, and actually save about, I think it saved like $2 million.
Oh, geez.
That was a lot of money.
It was a lot of money. Nobody ever said, "Oh, that was all achieved."
Yeah, and I've had people tell me that they've had locations selected because they took a picture of a doorknob, and
really,
it
why
suddenly
not?
sold the feeling of that location. So suddenly that came. I've taken pictures. I had one director that loved stained glass windows. And so whenever I was anywhere that I would see an interesting window, even if it wasn't stained glass, I would take a picture of it. And sure enough, a shot ended up in the film where they were using stained glass windows, because it came to his, you know, the shot got created in his head looking at scout photos. So you have to you do think about not being afraid to take something fun or artistic, not just what's the location look like. You know, take something fun. Maybe try a black and white to show the light coming through those windows. Or, you know, there was a scene in one project that was two people talking in front of a window, and during the tech scout, and it was still not a selected location, I took a picture of the UPM and the director standing in a window talking to each other. And when they saw that image later in black and white, they selected that location because they were like, "Oh, see, that's exactly the scene right there."
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? I see inspiration can come from everywhere.
Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free, and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics. Also, check us out on Instagram at team.deakins. See you next time.